Welcome everyone to the Adventurers Club, our Thursday night broadcast. We appreciate you joining us. If you like what you hear tonight or have seen in the past, please like this and subscribe to our channel. We bring you content every week, every Thursday. So tune in, learn something, listen to some interesting people. We also have our podcasts out now. So go to Spotify or any of the major podcast distributors and take it on the road with you. Give you something interesting to listen to while you're parked on the freeway these days. So tonight we have with us Roger McGrath. He's a history professor, author, advisor to Western Productions, amongst other things. I'd like to give a shout out to Max Hurlbut for referring him. Welcome, Roger.
Well, thank you for having me. It's, in a sense, a dream come true. Ever since I was a little kid in the early 1950s, I've heard about the Adventurers Club. And it was always about somebody exploring some river in Borneo or New Guinea or somewhere at what to me were the ends of the earth. And so here I am in this illustrious hall. It's great.
Well, we're glad to have you. We're happy to share with you. Yeah, we originally, I was talking with Max about Tombstone, because I have a family connection to Tombstone and the OK Corral shootout, and couldn't drag him on to talk about it, but he highly recommended you, and so here we are. I really appreciate you making the trip and hanging out with us tonight.
Well, someday you have to drag Max in here, because he was actually the city marshal for Tombstone.
Yes,
for a couple of years.
I've seen that photo.
Yeah.
Thinking there'd be nobody better to talk about that event.
So he lived it.
So you were just talking about adventure at the ends of the earth, but the Western, well, the American West, it's not even the United States, was the edge of the earth a long time ago, and maybe not that long ago.
Yeah, people forget that just west of the Mississippi, in the era that became known as the Mountain Man era, from about early 1820s to 1840, the over 1.5 million square miles of territory that they explored was pretty much unknown. And so here they could go out on the American continent, at least the western half of it, and venture into territory where even Indians didn't go. People think, well, the Indians had been, well, no, that's not true. The Indians were in certain areas, but they weren't exploring and going on adventures. They tended to be where food resources existed.
Yeah.
And so in the high mountains and mountain passes and remote mountain valleys, they weren't there. The beaver were there, and that's why the mountain men went there. So the mountain men went to areas, and they were the first human beings in most of these areas they went to. Because they were in search of beaver. I mean, the Plains Indians went where buffalo were. Buffalo was their primary food source. And other Indians in other areas had certain kinds of food sources, and that's where they were. And so this meant they were vast areas, pretty much untouched by human beings. But the mountain men explored everything. And it's a certain irony that they were going after, for a commercial purpose, all these areas. Excuse me, to trap beaver pelts, and beaver pelts went for $5, $6, $7 a pelt, which was huge money.
Good money at the time.
At the time, remember?
That's
average,
amazing.
Yeah, the Eastern working man for a 12-hour day earned $1. Oh. So one beaver pelt would bring you $5, $6, $7, like a week's worth of work. And the average mountain man would bring in 200 to 300 beaver pelts a year. And some brought in 500, 600 beaver pelts in a year. And some of these men became relatively wealthy and were well fixed for their time. On the other hand, it's very dangerous.
Yes.
Many mountain men died. There were hostile Indians. There were friendly Indians as well. But if you made friends with this particular tribe, then automatically this other tribe became your enemy.
Enemies here, of course.
So Indians were a problem. Then too, there were blizzards, there were scorching deserts, there were grizzlies. Grizzlies in that era were all over the West. One mountain man claimed he counted 220 different grizzlies in one day. And very often, mountain men counted 50, 60, 70 grizzlies. Grizzlies are fairly rare today, certain remote parts of the American West. But in those days, they were everywhere. And you didn't want to get between a she grizzly and her cubs, as some mountain men found out. So there was nature, there were animals, there were hostile Indians. All of this and raging rivers, too, crossing these rivers. So mountain men died in a number of ways out there. On the other hand, they could get rich, at least well fixed, for men of that era by trapping the beaver. But why I said it was an irony, what kept these men out there was a sense of adventure. Exploration, adventure, independence. And they tended to be adventurous types to begin with. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been out there. And then they tended to be ornery types. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been out there. It was dangerous. It was rugged. And what these mountain men endured is almost beyond belief today. For example, Tom Smith, he suffered an arrow wound that actually, the arrow penetrated his leg and pinned him to his horse. And the mountain men were able to get the arrow out of him, but infection set in. And he knew that he would die unless the leg was amputated. Well, there wasn't the battalion aid station and corpsmen or doctors there to do the job. Tom Smith started filing teeth in his knife, and he supervised sawing through his leg, tying off the arteries, and then burning the stump, cauterizing the stump. Within a few days, he was up moving around, carving a peg leg for himself. 2 weeks later, he went off with the trapping brigade on horseback.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's mind-boggling.
Unbelievable.
From then on, he was known as Peg Leg Tom Smith. But many of the mountain men suffered terrible wounds like this, and yet they persevered and survived life in California. Spanish called it Alta California. It would soon become Mexican California, but still until the Treaty of Cordoba in 1821, it was Spanish California. Very thinly populated. Now, the number of Indians, we don't know. But the number of Spanish settlers there and some Irish and French and English only numbered 5,000, 6,000. So it was very thinly populated.
But they weren't going overland to get there, right?
Well, no, they went in the early days of settlement. Some pioneer settlers came up, led by Father Sarah and Juan de Portola, we tend to call him. They came up, and they came up through Baja, because there were already Jesuit missions in Baja. And by the time they colonized California in 1769, the Jebbies had been kicked out of Baja, kicked out of the New World, in fact, 1767, because they had become too wealthy, too independent.
Yes, exercise control.
And too much of a threat to the Spanish crown. So they'd been kicked out. And so this meant that the missions up here in California were established by Franciscans, Father Sarah and the others.
Sounds vaguely like the Crusaders.
Yes,
story.
there's all, power, factions, fights, all these things were going on. So by 1776, there was a handful of missions, I think 6 missions and 2 presidios. There were much earlier settlements in New Mexico, the upper Rio Grande Valley. And 2 Franciscans got the idea that they ought to connect the missions of the upper Rio Grande Valley with the newly established missions of Alta California. It was Francisco Dominguez and Sylvester Escalante. And they set out on their own. Burroughs and these 2 padres set out on their own for the upper Rio Grande Valley. And they pioneered a route northward into Colorado, then through Colorado and southern Utah and Arizona to the Colorado River. And there they met a Franciscan mission who pioneered a route through the Cajon Pass, across the Mojave Desert to the Colorado River. And it became known as the Old Spanish Trail. However, after their pioneering efforts, it wasn't used. And it was forgotten. And so it was reopened in 1828-29 by American mountain men, William Wolfskill and Ewing Young. Again, the mountain men, see, all these routes that we use today, modern highways, railroads, were pioneered by the mountain men. And those are the routes that later the pioneer settlers took, that the 49ers took, rushing out to the gold fields of California. The railroads took, then the interstate highways took. This was all explored, pioneered, mapped, word passed to the east by the mountain men. They did all this. And that Old Spanish Trail reopened there in the late 1820s by these 2 mountain men. And one of them, William Wolfskill, settled in Los Angeles. And he developed the largest citrus grove, oranges, in California. And he also set out grapevines and had a large vineyard. So what do mountain men do when they retire? They become little old winemakers.
Yes.
Well, that's what William Wolfskill did, but also this orange grove. Ewing Young went on up to the Willamette Valley of Oregon and became one of the first American settlers in Oregon's Willamette Valley, one of the early pioneers there. Other routes to the west, staying in the southwest, another mountain man and his father, Sylvester Patty, the father, and James Patty, his son, James Ohio Patty. So they were from Ohio. And he was born in 1803 when Ohio came into the Union. So his parents gave him the middle name Ohio. So James Ohio Patty and his father Sylvester Patty came out in the 1820s, early 1820s, on the Santa Fe Trail, a trail that was established between St. Louis, which was our western settlement at that date.
Kind of the front line.
The front lines on the west side of the Mississippi. Of course, established by the French, Pierre Leclerc established that. And out of St. Louis, by then it became American, they established trade between St. Louis and Santa Fe, New Mexico. However, the trade was prohibited at first, but they thought, oh, they're ripe for our trading goods. And so they carried them in Murphy wagons, these big freight wagons, by an Irish immigrant, Wheelwright, built these wagons in St. Louis, and they were perfect for carrying heavy cargo out to Santa Fe.
So who was it that was prohibiting the trade?
The Spanish.
Spanish, okay.
It was opened up when the Mexicans took over, but this was typical because the French, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, everybody followed this policy of mercantilism, this economic policy, that you prohibited foreign trade, or all the trade had to be carried in your ships or your wagons, everything, this policy of kind of economic nationalism. And that's one of the reasons for our American Revolution. because when the British tried to crack down and enforce their mercantilist policies after this period known as period of salutary neglect, where they didn't really enforce the navigation acts, well, we've gotten used to free trade.
Yes. We weren't going to give it up easily.
And weren't going to give it up, you know. It's one of the principal factors for the American Revolution. Well, so Spain has followed the same policy. So early pioneers on that Santa Fe Trail used to be thrown in jail in Santa Fe and their goods confiscated. But still, some guys managed to slip in, trade on the sly. Smugglers, actually, you know, that's what they were. Just like John Hancock.
Sure.
The British thought him as a smuggler. We thought him as a merchant, you know, trader, merchant.
All depends which end of the goods you're on.
Your perspective. So anyway, over this trail went James Patty and his father Sylvester, and they decided to push further. And they said, well, how about this place, California, out there? We heard it's full of horses and cattle. Maybe we could go out there and trap beaver on the way and bring some horse herds back and trade them farther east. Just enterprising Americans of that era. Well, they struck out and they pioneered a route on the south bank of the Gila River to the Mojave River. And it became known as the Gila River Trail. And it became one of the principal trails to California. Again, pioneered by these mountain men, father and son team in that case. They also went up into the Grand Canyon and penetrated fairly far up in the Grand Canyon. And they passed word east of these things, as other mountain men did later, of other wonders of the West. And the mountain men became known as tellers of tall tales. And yet, they were only describing what they actually saw. But people couldn't believe it. I mean, imagine describing the Grand Canyon to somebody living on the eastern seaboard. Oh, they wouldn't believe such things existed. Or Yellowstone. And again, the mountain men were the first guys in there. And they described it and passed the word to the east. Think of the giant sequoias, the trees that big.
Unimaginable.
Unimaginable. And mountain men, again, were the first to see that. And then the very tall coastal redwoods, over 300 feet tall, up in northwestern California. Well, again, the mountain men saw those and looked up and talked about trees that were over 300 feet tall, passed that word to the east. Well, that and many other wonders of the American West. And so these guys are telling these tall tales, wild, hyperbolic tales, yet they were true.
I wondered about that a little bit because obviously there's got to be some written history that we know all of this from, but I was thinking in the Wild West, a lot of stories got kind of taken on by journalists, newspapermen, whatever, and passed back, and by the time they got back, they were completely out of proportion to what actually happened.
Yeah, this was truer of a later era.
Yeah.
And especially of the cattle towns of Kansas. Mm-hmm. So that some of the stories that were actually true, then dime novelists got a hold of that and used it. And yes, great exaggeration of gunfights and other things that actually happened, but the frequency of these fights was wildly exaggerated. And I mean, there were gunfighters that killed 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 men for real. But by the time the dime novelists got through with them, they had killed 20 or 30 men. You know, so double, triple the number of men. I mean, it's a later era, but it's a good example. Billy the Kid. We can fairly well document he killed 7 men. And of course, he died by the time he was 21.
Yeah. It's not a long run.
No, but that's quite a few guys to kill by the time you're 21 years old. Well, it came down to us that he killed 21 by the time he was 21. Mm-hmm. So it tripled the number. But still, if you think about that, well, this young teenage kid and then turned 20, and at 21 he himself was killed, had killed, only 7 men? Yeah, I mean, think of that, you know. So these people say, oh, yeah, well, that's all mythological. It's all exaggerated wildly. And, oh, only 7 men.
Just a paltry half dozen plus.
Yeah, and so these, the tales of the mountain men, somehow it didn't become the same, just the media hadn't reached the state that it had a generation or two later. And so much of their history was lost to us. And it didn't quite become the same part of our culture that the post-Civil War period of the Old West became. And you think about this, the Mountain Man era, what great material for Hollywood. And yet I can think of only 2 movies that focus, 2 movies, all the movies made, only 2 I can think focus on the Mountain Man era. And that was Across the Wide Missouri, starring Clark Gable. And it's a good movie. It is a good movie. And really good on the Mountain Man. A fairly accurate, authentic depiction of the Mountain Men. It's good. And another one titled The Mountain Men, starring Charlton Heston and Brian Keith. And it too is good, but they try to put a bunch of stories in that make it a little too disjointed. Yeah. But still, it's good, and it's a fairly accurate depiction of the mountain men.
Just doesn't flow well.
Well, it's not quite the story that Across the Wide Missouri is with Clark Gable. It's a little better storytelling. But the other is good, and I mean, it shows you a fairly realistic depiction of the mountain men, both movies. But that's it, as far as I can think. And you think of all the things they did. So we have, and then the central trails to California and the Pacific Coast, they too were pioneered by mountain men. Jedediah Smith had one of the most amazing expeditions, actually 2, in all of history, anywhere, anytime. He set out in 1826 from the Mountain Man Rendezvous at the Great Salt Lake. They had rendezvous at different spots in the American West. And at first, in the very early days, they had floated their packs of beaver pelts on rafts and in canoes and down the Missouri River, the Big Muddy. Sure. And they floated them down to St. Louis. But a lot of bad things could happen going down the Missouri, and it was time consuming. So a mountain man and became more St. Louis fur trader, but he had led early expeditions. William Ashley thought up, well, let's hold a rendezvous high up in the beaver country each year. And so the mountain men then would assemble in the summer, July or August, at some pre-designated spot in the Rockies somewhere. And it could be at Bear Lake, it could be at the Great Salt Lake, it could be along the Green River, it could be in Jackson Hole, which then was Dave Jackson's hole. He was a mountain man. And a hole to the mountain man was a valley, a hole. Or it could be on the other side of the Grand Tetons, on the western side, Pierre's Hole. On the Wind River, some spot. So all these spots each year in a different location.
So did they pick the location for the following year?
Yes. Ahead of time. Everybody knew, okay, next year we meet at. And so the St. Louis fur traders, with wagons of supplies and goods, would be there at the rendezvous, and the mountain men would come in and trade their packs of beaver there. So they didn't have to go back to St. Louis each year. And they didn't need much, the mountain men didn't need much. They needed their Hawken rifles. They needed their Hawken rifles, which was the rifle of choice for the mountain men. In the early 1820s, the mountain men used the Kentucky rifle, which had been used for generations on the American frontier. But they found out in the West, for big game, grizzlies, and elk, moose, well, the Kentucky rifle just wouldn't bring down that big game. Kentucky rifle is usually about 40 calibers. They varied because they weren't standardized, and they were made by different Pennsylvania Dutch gunsmiths, Dutch, Deutsch, Germans. Pennsylvania Dutch, of course, are not Dutch, they're Germans. And the Germans in Europe were the best gunsmiths. And the German immigrants to America, Pennsylvania in particular, is about 1/3 German at the time of our revolution. People forget that. But the Hessian mercenaries that came in, some of them left the British forces because they found all their fellow Germans there in Pennsylvania. And
settle down
found all his German girls, you know.
Yeah.
So, hey. But the Germans produced those Kentucky rifles. They were the finest gunsmiths, usually in Reading or Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But they were various, but usually more like 40 caliber. And they were much longer barrels. And they had lighter loads of black powder. And they were accurate up to 200 yards. But not for the big game of the West. You know, they just didn't have that. Buffalo, grizzlies, yeah, I mean, that was out west. And so the Hawken brothers, Sam and Jake Hawken in St. Louis, developed the Hawken rifle, and they called it the Rocky Mountain Rifle. And this is about 1825. But everybody just called it, after the Hawken brothers, the Hawken rifle. And so that's all everybody knew it as, and it became. It was usually 50 or 54 caliber, and a much heavier load of black powder. And perhaps most importantly, shorter barrel, of course, easier on horseback. Where in the East, you're walking through the woods. Out West, you're on horseback. But most importantly, it was a percussion cap system. Whereas the Kentucky had a pan of powder out here. And flash in the pan,
yes.
Well, that became American colloquialism because it happened so often. The pan of powder here would ignite, flash, and it wouldn't burn through the keyhole into the main powder charge. And that was rather disconcerting when Indians were coming at you or a grizzly coming at you. So the Hawkins fired almost every time with the percussion cap system, with the fulminated mercury. They had just developed that at the same time, so everything came together. So the Hawken brothers came up with this rifle, and the mountain men had to have it. But they were relatively expensive at the time, but it saved your life. So this became the rifle that the mountain men carried and replaced the Kentucky rifle by the mid-1820s. And everywhere they went, they carried their Hawken rifle.
Now, were these were, when we talk about mass-produced, I'll just say repetitive manufacturing of things. A lot of the flintlocks were handcrafted, kind of one of a kind.
Well, these were handcrafted as well.
Were they?
Yeah, they were handcrafted as well. Standardization and production line, that really started coming in with Sam Colt and some, interchangeability of parts and everything. Although the Hawken brothers did a heck of a job at attempting standardizing all their parts in their rifles, but not quite as it became of a later era. This was still a limited production there in their shop in St. Louis. And so they remained relatively expensive rifles for that era. I mean, it would be something like $2,000 in today's money, something like that. But you'd make the sacrifice and do whatever you had to do. And often, some great fur trader like William Ashley would supply his men for his trapping expeditions. He would supply them. And once these men saved up enough money, they'd be buying their own Hawkins and maybe going off as independent, or what they called free trappers. But at first, most of these men were part of trapping brigades, sponsored by some wealthy merchants and fur traders in St. Louis. And they supplied them with a rifle, because that was a lot of money to come up with. And most of these guys were young guys when they went off. And William Ashley, think about this, Ken, that, and anybody out there, think about this. You're in the Adventurers Club. Well, here you are, 19 years old, 18 years old, 20 years old, and you're on the American frontier somewhere, and you pick up this St. Louis newspaper, and newspapers tended to be sent to all sorts of towns, and they were passed, and what they had in the newspapers tended to be picked up and reprinted by other newspapers at the time. We were a very literate society, including the mountain men. People don't think of that. Far more literate than we are today. We're about 99% literate.
Yes.
Yeah. Today, I don't know. I mean, mostly functionally illiterate coming out of right here out of LA schools. It's frightening. But they weren't barbarians out here. And they read. No cell phones, no television. Yeah. They read.
They were forced to absorb information.
Exactly. They read. By campfire, they read. I mean, the mountain men, when they're holed up for the winter, it was known as the Rocky Mountain College. The University of the Rocky Mountains. They were holed up, and they had stacks of books were brought out there.
So you keep the fire going and keep reading.
They were all the great works of history and literature. I mean, they could recite Shakespeare. Think about that. These mountain men reciting Shakespeare in these holed up in some valley in the Rockies for the winter. But that's what they had. They had the great works of literature, of history, and the Bible. And they knew these things, could recite them. They could recite great poetry, everything. And people don't have that image. They have the image some kind of uncouth, crude barbarians. No, not at all.
They were capitalist businessmen.
Well, they were also that. But you can see it was the romance and adventure that kept them there.
Sure.
But yes, that's why I said it's ironic.
It would be interesting to, I imagine the transition into that lifestyle and then later potentially back out would be an interesting struggle.
Well, many couldn't do it. And so they became scouts for the Army or led pioneer wagon trains west. And a good example of that would be Tom Fitzpatrick. He came as a teenager from Ireland, wound up in St. Louis, and he was one of those guys that went on the original William Ashley Trapping Brigade in 1822, read in a St. Louis newspaper an ad posted by William Ashley in there, and it said, "Wanted, adventurous young men to ascend the Missouri to its source and beyond, and they're to be employed for 1, 2, or 3 years, trapping beaver." And can you imagine this idea? Think about that, to the source of the Missouri. I mean, who had been there but Lewis and Clark? Yeah. That was it. And so you're a young guy, 17, 18, 19, 20, and you read that and you ran to, and it said, "Inquire, William Ashley at the so-and-so," And so the next day you were there, or the next week you were there, and he would interview you and think, well, are you fit for this? And are you a marksman? Are you this and that? And he hired him on for his first expedition up the Missouri. And some of the guys that were hired on that first one, like Tom Fitzpatrick, Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, these guys became legendary in mountain man lore. But they were just young guys at that time. Now think of that today. If you could do something like that, for everybody in the Adventurers Club, they'd be gone. They'd do it. And that's what they did. And they got in a harrowing fight with the Arikara Indians, the Rees, as they tended to call them, Arikaras, Arikarees, the Rees. Just a bloody, gnarly battle where all sorts of mountain men were killed. But the guys that survived, then they really had a lesson, because the Rees first feigned friendship and were trading with them, and the mountain men let their guard down. And early the next morning, they were camped on a beach on the Missouri River, and the Rees villages were on these bluffs above them. And at dawn the next morning, the Rees began pouring fire into their camp. People think, bow and arrows. No, rifle fire.
Yeah.
Because all the traders traded with the Indians to get their furs. And they traded rifles to them. So not only arrows and spears, but rifle fire. Here on the high ground into this group of mountain men. But they learned, and those survivors became some of the best mountain men. Well, later not John Coulter, excuse me, that was earlier, but Kit Carson became a mountain man in the 1830s. Kind of got into it late, the last days. But two good examples of what they did. When the mountain man era ended, 1840, the last rendezvous, and that was because the beaver pelts lost their value, because now it was the beaver hat gone out and the silk hat came in. The fashion in the United States and in Europe, it changed. That was it. And also the beaver had become relatively scarce by then. They'd been hunted out of all these areas. And that's another reason the mountain men became such explorers, because they had to go ever farther afield to find virgin beaver country, that hasn't been trapped out. But Tom Fitzpatrick became a scout for wagon trains. He led the first party of Catholic missionaries to the Pacific Northwest that included Father Pierre de Smet, Jesuits that went up to the Pacific Northwest. And that included the first party of overland pioneers to California, because half that party went on to Oregon, but half turned off and went to California, the Bartleson Bidwell party. And they later said, gee, we never would have made it this far were it not for Tom Fitzpatrick, a mountain man. And then he went on and was a scout and pathfinder for the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont. And Kit Carson did the same thing. He became a scout and pathfinder for Fremont. So some picked up, or for the Army. Many became scouts for the Army in the West.
I'm curious about, we talk about them leading parties. These guys weren't really cartographers. Did they have their secret notes or sketches of maps, or was it all memory? Or
well, for some it was memory, but they all eventually drew crude maps of the West. And they actually were pretty good. They had these locations, might not have had latitude and longitude, couldn't call in coordinates or something, but they were roughly pretty darn good. And it sure, there were ideas of the West that went back a couple hundred years or more, that they certainly disabused people farther east of some of these notions of the West, as the Lewis and Clark expedition did. But now Lewis and Clark, between that and the Gila River, all that area from almost the Canadian border to today's Mexican border, well, just in that northern area, the Lewis and Clark expedition went. So all that area in between, the mountain men filled everybody in. Jedediah Smith took this party, about 20 mountain men, from the Great Salt Lake in 1826, when the rendezvous broke up, through Utah, down eventually, I mean, it's a lot, the Sevier River to the Virgin River to the Colorado River to the Mojave River. And nobody knew these. Nobody knew anything. He was just traveling, trying to get to this place called California. And eventually through Cajon Pass, and he wound up, I think he left August 22nd from the rendezvous and wound up at Mission San Gabriel November 27th. Now, it was illegal to enter California. Still, it's a Mexican period now, but it was still illegal without some kind of documentation. He was an illegal alien.
Yes.
And they enforced it,
Yes.
unlike us today. But they enforced it. But the Mission Padres, they treated him well, and these men were exhausted after 3 months pioneering a trail into and crossing the Mojave Desert. Try that. But he went off to try to get permission to Governor Echeandía, who happened to be in San Diego at the time. Should have been in Monterey. That was the capital of California. He had a girlfriend in San Diego, so Jose Maria Echeandía, the governor of California, was in San Diego. So Jedediah Smith went off to San Diego and presented a gift of fine beaver pelts to Governor Echeandía, and some American ship captains happened to be in port, hide and tallow traders happened to be in port in San Diego, and they said good things on his behalf. They didn't know him, but he was an American. Mm-hmm. Echeandía gave him permission to go back, gather up his men at Mission San Gabriel, head back out of California by the same way he had come. Otherwise, he'd be thrown in prison. Mm. But what Smith did was go through Cajon Pass again, but then he turned up the backside of the San Gabriel Mountains, went through the Antelope Valley, over the Tehachapi Mountains, then down the San Joaquin Valley, and made a winter cap on the Stanislaus River in the foothills of the Sierra. Hmm. Now, he wasn't out of California, but the Spaniards before them, and now the Mexicans, they never penetrated that area of California. Hmm. They just weren't there, and there was nobody there. And so he made the winter camp there. Now, here's what he did in the spring. He took 2 men with him, Robert Evans, who later became a producer in Hollywood. No, not that one. It's an earlier Robert Evans. It's in the spring of 1827 with a couple mountain men, Jed Smith and a couple of his mountain men, Silas Goebel and Robert Evans. They took off up the Stanislaus River and crossed the Sierra Nevada. Now, they didn't know what the Sierra Nevada was. In his diary, Smith records it as Mount Joseph. He called it Mount Joseph. The snow was 8 feet deep. No trail, no Muir's guide, no guide to the John Muir Trail, which I had as a kid and hiked the John Muir Trail. Mm. But he had that guide to it. Yeah, nothing. They just went up, pioneered a route in 8 feet of snow over the Sierra Nevada and down the eastern face of the Sierra Nevada. And
so this is the first known transit?
The first recorded crossing of the Sierra Nevada. Now, there's at some points, Indians did it,
Sure.
But this is the first known crossing, recorded crossing. And it was done by Americans, and ironically, not east to west, but west to east. And then he went across the deserts of Nevada, and this was just as dangerous and arduous a trek as the crossing of the Sierra Nevada. No water. And after 3 days without water, Robert Evans gave out. The rule of 3 is everybody in the Adventurers Club will know that. 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food or sex. No, but that's the rule of 3s. And so 3 days without water and Evans collapses. Smith went ahead and found a spring. I mean, just accidentally came upon this spring, filled up a kettle that held a gallon of water, brought it back, and they revived Evans. He drank the entire gallon in 4 quarts of water, but he probably was dehydrated more than that, you know, but he was obviously, you lose 10% of your body weight, water. You've lost that amount of water, and it's near death. It's time near death. They then crossed Nevada and the deserts through Nevada and Utah, and finally came within sight of the Great Salt Lake. And in his diary, Smith said, "A most cheering view." No kidding, Chad. And they
Understatement of the year.
and from there they went up to Bear Lake, where the rendezvous of 1827 was being held. And there the mountain men all cheered their arrival because they figured they were dead. They were gone. And then think about this. 2 weeks later, the rendezvous broke up. Jed organized another 20 guys, went back off to California. But there at the crossing of the Colorado River, they were attacked by Indians that they had traded with the year before, friendly. And so they just, the way we reckon that the Indians realized, well, there's only so many of these guys. And they concentrated several hundred Indians this time, and we're going to get their horses and all their goodies. And they killed half of the party. Jed Smith and the other half made it across the Mojave and hightailed it westward into the Mojave Desert and lost the Indians. And they arrived back at Mission San Gabriel and then back up to the winter camp at Stanislaus. And Smith said, well, I'll try once more to do this legally because I want to explore all this California. Might be some good beaver streams here. They were trapping the foothills of the Sierra for the beaver. And he went to San Jose, and there he's thrown in jail. And he probably would have rotted for life there, except for the intercession of ship captains. And they got him out on a $30,000 bail. It's like $3 million today.
Wow.
$3 million today.
That's amazing.
But again, American.
Yeah.
An American. He then took off up the Sacramento Valley, looking for a passage through the Sierra up there, and instead decided to turn northwestward. And he crossed through northwestern California, pioneered a route, wound up on the coast. It's really rugged country in far northern California there. Pioneered a route through there to the coast. And therefore, that's why we had Jedediah Smith State Redwoods Park up there. And that's why we have Smith River and all that. He then went up into Oregon and turned up the Umpqua River because they'd heard about the Hudson Bay Company up there, the British, and they were getting all these fine beaver pelts up in the Oregon country, which Oregon country then meant Oregon, Washington, parts of Idaho and Montana, and British Columbia. 670,000 square miles, larger than Alaska, and twice as big as Texas. Nothing's twice, yes. That was what was meant by the Oregon country. So he wanted to see what they were getting up there. And at the Umpqua villages, they stopped and traded with the Umpqua. And Jed Smith, as what he did daily, before dawn, he would set out to kind of figure out what route they would take the next day. And as he returned from his early morning scouting, he thought something's wrong. And he saw the Umpqua early in the morning, then after he had left, had slaughtered all his men. He didn't know it, but 2 of his men had managed to dive into the Umpqua, although wounded, and float downstream to the coast. And they survived, and they eventually would make their way to the Hudson Bay post that then Smith went to at Fort Vancouver on the north bank of the Columbia River. And that was the big post for Hudson Bay. Now, here they were in British territory. They had been in Mexican territory, now in British territory. But Smith was taken in by the chief factor, which meant kind of the commander of all Oregon country. In Hudson Bay parlance, they called him the chief factor. A guy named Dr. John McLaughlin. And his name would suggest he was Irish, at least half Irish. His dad was Irish, and his mom was half Scottish and half French. And he was a giant in many ways, 6'7". Big Neanderthalic bone structure, full head of white hair. And he ruled the country like an emperor up there. But he was very generous and hospitable. And he sent his men to retrieve what they could from the Umpqua slaughter. Because the Umpqua, they obeyed McLaughlin, you know. Yeah. And so they did bring back traps and pelts, some of them, to Smith. Well, after resting and recovering, Smith then struck out for the Mountain Man Rendezvous, I think 1828, I think it was at Pierre's Hole on the western side of the Tetons. He then struck out from Fort Vancouver through Washington and Idaho to the rendezvous. Now think of that. I mean, it's mind-boggling. 3 years later, he retired to St. Louis after these expeditions and mapping and recording all of this for everybody else. Jedediah Smith. And actually, in 1831, he was wealthy, fixed, retired to St. Louis, took off his buckskins, put on tailored suits, and could live happily the rest of his life there with money, wealth, and he had a girl he had his eyes on, everything, set for life. And some traders on the Santa Fe Trail prevailed upon Jed. They said, hey, you can do it. You just have this knack. You and Tom Fitzpatrick, we want you on this trade caravan from St. Louis to Santa Fe. Because we want you to map a route through the Cimarron Desert in southwestern Kansas. Water holes were at a premium. And these wagons were pulled by mules and horses. They needed water, and a lot of it. But this was a shortcut through the Cimarron Desert. Rather than going due west into Colorado and then south through Raton Pass to Santa Fe. This was a shortcut, the hypotenuse of a triangle. But it was through the desert. You had to find water holes. Smith, he didn't want to do it. He said, I'm done. He finally accepted. They made it worth his while. And he and Fitzpatrick were the leaders of this. Well, they were out in the Cimarron Desert out there, hundreds of miles west of St. Louis, in the Cimarron Desert, leading this wagon caravan of trade goods to Santa Fe. And it was really a bad year. And Fitzpatrick was digging at one of the water holes, 'cause sometimes you'd dig down a few feet and there. Well, the water was there. It wasn't on the surface, but there it was. And Smith said, well, I'm going to try a little bit ahead out this direction. And Smith came to a water hole where there was water. But too late, he realized they were Comanche. Now, they weren't waiting for him, but they were waiting for buffalo to come to the water hole. So they were well armed with guns, with spears, with bow and arrow, everything. And it wasn't a buffalo, the one buffalo that came up there, but it was Jed Smith. He will do just fine. And Smith realized that the only thing he could do was make a bold entrance. He had his Hawken rifle. He had 2 pistols. And he made this bold entrance. And the Comanche, there was probably 2 or 3 dozen of them. They started spreading out to get around behind him as he rode up. And his horse spun around, nervous, spun around, and the Comanche opened fire. Smith opened fire. He killed the chief of this party of Comanche. But one shot, it takes time, muzzle loading. And he didn't have time to get his pistols. By that time, he was shot, run through with spears. Jedediah Smith, dead at this water hole in the Cimarron Desert. And we know all this because these Comanche traded with Mexican traders out of Santa Fe. And later on, Smith's pistols, I don't think his Hawken rifle showed up, but his pistols showed up. The Indians traded them
Interesting.
to Mexicans that brought them back to Santa Fe, and some other things from Smith. And they told the story as told to them by the Comanche. So Smith didn't make it. Other guys like Jim Bridger, Fitzpatrick lived a fairly long life despite some harrowing escapes from the Blackfeet. And he became the Indian agent for all the Indians of the High Plains. And again, ironically, he died in Washington, D.C., where he came down with pneumonia. I think he was about 60 years old at the time, negotiating an Indian treaty back in Washington, D.C. But still, 60 was pretty good. And
Yeah, for back then, that was a good run.
it was pretty good for all he had gone through. I mean, grizzly attacks, harrowing fights with Indians, blizzards, everything. By the way, talk about grizzlies. Jed Smith, that I've been describing, he was attacked by a grizzly in his ear, and part of his scalp and the side of his face was torn, pretty much torn off. And the other mountain men sewed it back on. They did a pretty good stitching job. And there was a portrait of him, and you can see he's not perfectly symmetrical. One's a little off, you know. But they did a good job, and somehow infection didn't set in. And he had suffered a grizzly attack. This was not unusual.
I have a question regarding, and we have a whole bunch of questions, I'm sure, out there. What would in those days, what would a mountain man, aside from his Hawken rifle and the supplies for that, what would be part of their kit, per se?
Well, he'd have his skinning knife. Skinning knife, he'd have a pistol in his belt. He'd have his possible sack hanging from his neck, would have things like an awl in it. He'd have scent in a little pouch from the beaver, from the musk glands of a beaver. He'd have this scent, and he'd put that on the traps to disguise his human scent. On his person, he'd have a powder horn. He'd on his pack horse, he'd have his traps. He would also have his flint, and certain other little tools for skinning and sewing. He would have his powder. Oh, he'd have his powder horn. I mentioned that. He'd have his lead. For lead balls, man. That's ram and jam 'em.
How about food?
Well, they did make jerky. They did make jerky. But there is buffalo that they hunted, and they consumed. It's amazing what they did. You think, gee, where'd they get their vitamin C? They didn't eat vegetables or fruit or anything. Well, somehow they survived very well, and they're very healthy, and mostly on buffalo. And these guys would sometimes eat pounds of buffalo a day, but think of the calories they were burning.
Sure.
But that was their primary game they lived off. They'd also shoot deer, eat venison, buffalo, but buffalo was primary. And of course, some of this would be dried and cured, and it became jerky. The Indians made what was known as pemmican, that was a version of that, and they also had pemmican stored that they would eat, but their diet was fairly limited, and they became pretty much carnivores.
So a lot of meat.
A lot of meat, and they were ridiculously healthy. They were lean, they were strong, they seem to be free of most disease and problems. It's when they went back to the settlements they had problems.
Started eating civilized food.
Well, it wasn't only the food, though, but they were up there in country that froze over in the winter, and it just wasn't good incubation for disease.
Yeah.
You know, they talk about disease. Well, most disease comes from tropical areas. Yeah. And this disease that was introduced from Europe into the Americas, it wasn't from Europe. It was from Asia and Africa that came into Europe, that then came into America. Europe was pretty free of disease because it froze.
Yeah.
It's not good for disease. Usually disease comes from these tropical areas, you know, and the Indians passed disease to Europe. Syphilis came from America, was passed to Europe, decimated Europe in the late 1400s, 1490s, when Columbus and the boys went back.
Yeah.
And then other voyages came back. They picked up syphilis in America, sent it back. And there was reciprocity from Europe. They said, well, have some smallpox.
Yes.
So they traded back.
Trade off a little.
Traded back and forth disease. But most of these diseases, the mountain men were free up there on the high plains and the Rockies and the West. It's generally dry country. It was generally disease-free, and part of that because of the lack of humidity, because of the freeze in the winter and everything. But yeah, they generally thrived on their diet, mainly buffalo and venison. And
Interesting. You willing to take some questions?
sure, I might mention before I do one other,
Sure.
that's very important here, for exploration in the West was Joe Walker. And Joe Walker, and this, when the beaver were getting trapped out, most of the areas the mountain men had known during the 1820s, by 1833 they were looking at unlikely places. And Joe Walker took a trapping party of men west from the Great Salt Lake, and he discovered the Humboldt River. And he called it the Barren River. It was later called Mary's River, Ogden's River, and Fremont put the name in honor of Alexander von Humboldt on the river, so we know it as Humboldt today. And Interstate 80 follows it, but that was pioneered by Joe Walker. And he led his men down the Humboldt and then across at the sink of the Humboldt around Lovelock, Nevada. I'm just chuckling here. One time I had to land the plane in Lovelock. Got caught in a blizzard. But anyway, so Lovelock can be beautiful at times, you know. But and then across a 40-mile desert to the Carson River, and then up over the eastern face, and again, no maps, nothing, he was pioneering it, with about 20 mountain men, Joe Walker, and up the eastern face of the Sierra Nevada. Can you imagine that? And there on the crest of the Sierra, they were trying to find a route down the western side of the Sierra, and they looked over into this valley, and it went thousands of feet straight down. Granite walls, thousands of feet, and water went over these granite walls and fell thousands of feet down. And we have mountain men keeping diaries describing this. Well, what they were looking down into was Yosemite Valley. And they were the first white men to look into Yosemite Valley.
What a sight.
Can you imagine that? And then they said, well, we can't go down here. And they went around the rim of Yosemite over to the northern side, and they looked down into another almost as spectacular valley. We don't know that today because it's filled with water, the Valley of the Tuolumne. And that's because of O'Shaughnessy Dam. Hetch Hetchy Reservoir and O'Shaughnessy Dam. Otherwise, we'd have a second Yosemite, not quite on that scale, but still spectacular.
Impressive.
But that's the water that feeds San Francisco. O'Shaughnessy Dam, Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, Tuolumne Valley. And then they went down into the giant sequoias. And they were the first whites to see the giant sequoias. Joe Walker's party.
Oh, amazing.
And later, many other adventures. But can you imagine that then? Again, mountain men, Yosemite Valley, the giant sequoias, Joe Walker's party. And we know Joe Walker because when they went up the Sierras, they had a Walker Lake and the East Walker River, that's what they took. And then in the southern Sierras, when he went back, Walker Pass. So the name is there, although most people don't know who this was or anything. But all sorts of adventures in California. Those are other stories for another time, perhaps.
All right. Oh, great. Thank you. Andy?
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for tuning in tonight and joining in the chat. It's lovely to see your smiling face. It's our first question of the night. Can you talk a bit more about the Jesuit priests out west and their sort of relationship with the mountain men?
Yeah, the first Jesuits were led west by Tom Fitzpatrick, which was convenient, I suppose, because he was Catholic. I don't know if he'd had any Jebby schooling. He left Ireland as a teenager, and he wound up leading this party of Jesuits. And it was lucky then that this pioneer party of settlers, the Bidwell party, Bartleson Bidwell, tagged along with them because they didn't know where they were going. And so Tom Fitzpatrick smoothed the way for them, but he was actually hired by the Jesuits, Father Pierre de Smet, to lead them to the Indians of the Pacific Northwest. They would missionize those Indians. Now, earlier in Canada, the Jesuits had led the way. They'd been very big in Canada. Jean Brebeuf, de Brebeuf, had been the leader of the Jesuits in Canada, who was martyred, burned at the stake. Horrific tortures he underwent. And he didn't moan, groan, cry for mercy, anything. And the Indians thought, this is powerful medicine. And when I endured more torture than anything they'd ever seen, they cut out pieces of his flesh and ate it in front of him while he was tied to this post and later roasted to death. I mean, the tortures were mind-boggling. And so the Jesuits became a powerful presence in Canada. And now they thought they should establish their presidents, establish themselves south of the Canadian border. And this party was led by Pierre de Smet, Belgian-born, but educated in America. He's a fascinating figure. He stood 6'8". He was a giant. It would be like somebody 7'2" or 3" today. A giant, and there in his robes with his fellow Jebbies going west across the plains, led by Tom Fitzpatrick, into Idaho and Montana. And they established missions there throughout the area. And they were highly successful because they take first of all, Jesuits are phenomenally well educated. Educated in many languages, European languages, but essentially their education is something like having at least a PhD, maybe 2 PhDs. And so these are extraordinary men to begin with. And among the Indians, they learn their languages. And this was unusual as well. Most earlier missionaries had relied on interpreters. And the Jesuits actually were some of the first to attempt to develop written scripts for Indian languages there in the Pacific Northwest. Again, the Indians were illiterate. They had no written script or anything. And they had difficulty communicating with each other, and that's why sign language developed. Because they spoke many different languages And then even in the same language group, they couldn't understand each other because they're various dialects and such. And so the Indians had very difficult times communicating with each other. So the Jesuits made real progress with their missions, with the Flatheads and other Indians of the area up there. So they have a real legacy of that up in Montana and Idaho in that area, especially among the Flatheads and Nez Perce and other Indians indigenous to that region. But Pierre de Smet, by the way, there's some interesting biographies on him, and it makes for some great reading because it's just not what most people think of. They don't even know that existed and occurred.
Okay, interesting.
Great, thank you so much. Next question from the chat. You say that the mountain men it seemed like the mountain men would eat the beaver that they caught. Have you ever had?
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, they didn't eat beaver.
Have you ever had beaver jerky? It was the question, and then you can go on and answer.
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. No. I've had buffalo jerky. I've had venison jerky. But no, I haven't had beaver in any form. I suppose after this question, I'm going to have to try it. No, I haven't. No, they skin the beaver and made their money from the pelts. Yes.
And then would they do anything with the meat, I guess, or would they just throw it away?
No, I mean unless now all bets are off here. It's like with the Indians. All bets are off if they were in distress and they were in dire circumstances. Yes, then under those circumstances, of course.
You're starving, your standards change some.
Absolutely, they ate anything. I mean, they talk about the Indians, they made use of every part of the buffalo. That's nonsense. Only under periods of starvation, severe winters and such, normally the Indians only took the choicest cuts of the buffalo cows. The bulls they didn't touch. Tough meat, forget it. And they just rotted on the prairies. They killed them by the thousands and let them rot on the prairies. Didn't use anything of the buffalo, the bulls. Because the hides were tougher, they used the cows. Now, all bets are off in periods of scarcity. Then they made use of the bulls. Normally they did not. And normally of the cows, they only made use of the choicest cuts. The shoulder meat, the rib, but most of even the cows, they just let rot. They used their skins for their lodges, but as I said, again, these were from the cows, not from the bulls. And most of the cows were just left to rot. Again, all bets, there was a strip known as the Dupuis from the French down the back that they also used, that cut of meat, but the choicest cuts. And so the mountain men in times of plenty, they wouldn't think of eating beaver. They ate buffalo, they ate venison. And so these practices, we think, and it's one of the greatest myths of American history. Oh, the Indians were conservationists and they made careful use. No, God. In later years, time of starvation or something, yes. But for most of the time, absolutely not.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that answer. Next question is related to the gun you have with you. Does it shoot? Is it functional?
Yeah, it sure is. You want to get down range? This is a black powder. It's a shooter. Yeah, absolutely. Percussion cap.
And where do you use it mostly?
Well, I haven't used it in years, but the shooting ranges, you can shoot black powder. They have black powder shooting matches. There was somebody here, member of the Adventurers Club, that went to these up in Utah.
That was Brian.
Yeah, excuse me, Brian?
Brian, yeah.
Okay, Brian, I don't have a last name, but Brian was talking about this, and I had a cousin that was into mountain man reenactments. And some of these guys today, they're as good as the mountain men. Mountain men were outstanding marksmen. And there's guys today also that are outstanding. And they do it exactly as the mountain men would do it in those days. So yeah, these old black powder rifles are shooters, and these guys are good at 70 paces, which was a normal shooting distance for marksmanship competitions among the mountain men and other Americans generally, with the Kentucky rifle too. Mark off 70 paces and shoot. And they were ridiculously good. But you had to be, because normally your first shot had to count.
Yeah.
With the Kentuckys, it took you a minute to reload. Now, percussion cap was faster, but it's still, the best mountain men, it took them 15, 20 seconds to reload. Now start counting. 1, 2, 3. And Indians are charging you, grizzlies are charging you. That's a long time.
That's a very long time.
So your first shot had to count, and that meant you had to be an expert marksman. And tell you something that they did, and back in the Kentucky rifle days, they would drive the nail. At 70 paces, they'd hit a nail on the head and drive it into a post, shot after shot. They'd also snuff the candle. And a burning candle, they wouldn't hit the candle, they wouldn't hit the wick. The round would pass above the wick and through the flame and blow it out, snuffing the candle. They'd also bore holes in shingles and put the shingle on top of a post, and you'd have to pass a round through the hole in the shingle. I mean, can you imagine that kind of marksmanship at 70 yards? So they were great by necessity. You had to be a great marksman. And those with the old Kentucky rifles were, those with the Hawken rifles were, and there's guys today that can exhibit that kind of marksmanship. There were mountain men who shot cups of whiskey off each other's head at 70 paces. Now you have to have real confidence in your partner to do that. At 70 yards, a cup of whiskey shot off your head. And they did that at the rendezvous. Now, hopefully they waited till after doing that to start consuming the whiskey.
Sure. Or it might have been overconsumption that inspired it.
I was going to say, how are they going to drink the whiskey if they shoot all the glasses?
Well, you hoped it was just the first cup was shot off the head of your partner out there.
This next question's from me, actually. Earlier today, we were hearing about some of your other adventures in reenactments. Can you talk a little bit about those and some of the things that you bring to those reenactments?
Well, again, this is up in Cache Valley, Utah. This is some years back. They have, at the end of July, they have the Festival of the American West up in Cache Valley, which Cache Valley is at the northern end of Cache Valley is Logan, Utah. Utah State is there, so if you know about where that was. And Cache Valley got its name from some mountain men at one time caching beaver pelts there. And they would dig big pits and cache beaver pelts and cover them up carefully. So they would hope that they'd be there upon their return. That's how it got its name. Well, there it's one of the best American West festival anywhere in the United States is there, and I haven't been to it in some years, but I can tell you 15 years, 20 years ago, it was fabulous. And they have different camps there. They all have an Indian camp where Indians today come and camp there in exactly as they would have camped in 1820 or 1840 or 50. They will have mountain men, reenactors come there and camp exactly as they would have back in 1820s or 1830s. Everything, their outfits, they're sewn just how they had to be sewn with tools and the materials of that era, the kind of deer skin, everything. These guys are really particular about being authentic in every way. They'd have cavalry, U.S. cavalry reenactors. And of course, in the 1830s and 40s, cavalry out west, they were known as dragoons, but cavalry. They'd have camps of those, and then pioneer encampments. And because of that, the country of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons up there, the pioneer camps will be mostly these Mormon families reenacting, and they are the best because the Mormons are steeped in their own history, which is history of the Old West. I mean, they came out there in the 1840s and pioneer settlements of all these communities, and thereafter continued coming out there to Utah, and actually other further flung settlements in the Kingdom of Deseret that Brigham Young developed. And so they have old wagons and other things all preserved from that era. They're very proud of that. And so these pioneer encampments, and that just brought tears to my eyes, because you see little kids dressed as they would be in the 1840s or something, and men playing fiddle tunes of the era. It's too much. And cooking on these open fires the way they would have cooked, or with Dutch ovens out in wagons, and then sleeping there overnight in these great meadows they have there. And as the sun goes down to the west, over the Wellesley Mountains, you're just taken right back into that era with the airs of Irish and Scottish airs wafting through the air to you. It just was great. And then during the days, at different spots, different reenactments would going on. I mean, there would be battles, there would be shooting contests, and I had the great opportunity to participate in some of these because a friend of mine was retired up there, a guy named Ray Hauser, and Ray Hauser had owned and operated the Pony Express gun store on Ventura Boulevard in Encino. And he had trained a lot of people in Hollywood with guns and how to quick draw and everything else. And he had a huge gun collection, of course, in his gun store, famous gun store. He retired up in Cache Valley. And so he'd bring all sorts of his guns there, including a Gatling gun. And we fire the Gatling gun for the audiences there. And think about the Gatling gun. What's the cyclical rate of the Gatling gun? As fast as you can crank.
Yes.
That's the cyclical rate. So yeah, these reenactments, if somebody has an opportunity to go to some of these somewhere, you would really enjoy them. Because I can tell you, these people that they're almost fanatical about preserving the history and everything they do, the authenticity of that. By the way, I used to bring reenactors into my classes at UCLA. And these classes, American West, had seating capacity and beyond in these auditoriums like Moore Hall, Moore 100, seating capacity of almost 500, full. And reenactors come in on the stage and have shootouts on the stage with blanks, but black powder. And the hall would fill up with smoke. And they would stage something like the shootout at the OK Corral. And these reenactors, they come in, if they wore glasses, they'd have the glass ground as it would have been in 1881, October of 1881. It was everything the kind of buttons, everything in their outfits. And they'd be dressed exactly as the McLowrys and the Clantons, or the Earps and Holiday. Everything, perfectly authentic. And in the class, I remember I'd never let on what was going to happen. I'd never let on reenactors who were going to come into the class. And certainly not let on that they would start shooting. And by the way, I did it with mountain men too. Mountain men reenactors came in, and I had one volunteer, and he was from Sigma Nu, one of the fraternity brothers, you know. So I had all these fraternities, sororities in the classes, and they pushed this one guy up there. Oh, here, do it. And he was on the rowing team at UCLA back when they had it. And he must have been 6'4", 6'5", as these rowers, the physics of rowing. And so they know these guys, tall guys, are really the right biomechanics. And so we got him up there and put a cup of whiskey on his head. And this one mountain man went through the whole procedure. And everybody was sitting, was he really? But this was just across the stage, wasn't 70 paces. And I saw this guy, he thought, are they really gonna do it? But he wasn't gonna chicken out.
Break a sweat.
He was standing there, he was gonna continue standing there. All the Sigma Nu fraternity brothers were out there, and rival fraternities like Sigma Chi and all the others were out there too. And so he was going to go through with it, and I could see in his eyes. And this mountain man that was doing all this was going through it. Like he said, now look, just relax, hold still. This is much shorter distance than I usually fire at, so don't worry.
A little confidence builder.
And I'll err on the high side, so don't worry, you know. And this guy thought, God, is this for real, you know? But he still stood there, and since he was so tall, you know, standing there, you'd see him slightly wave. Yeah, we had a lot of fun with the reenactors actually came into the classroom. And by the way, accidentally, one time a daughter of one of the reenactors was taking my class. And I didn't know it, but her boyfriend was there with her. Her boyfriend was a photographer for the Daily Bruin. Oh. He was there with camera and everything. And these reenactors came in, he started shooting. And they started firing, and he continued shooting. The next day, front page on the Daily Bruin. Well, Chancellor Young, they said he was passing kidney stones in his office.
I'll bet.
Guns on campus? He couldn't even, and he calls up and all this, and he calls up the police chief, who was a buddy of mine, Pat Connolly, was the police chief for UCLA. And I'd been doing it for 10 years. And I had only cleared it with the police chief, with Pat. And his officers fought over who would get to escort the reenactors to my classroom.
So they get to talk to them on the way.
And they said, oh, chief, so-and-so got to go last time. I got a guy who want to go this time. And so I've been doing it for these years because they love to watch this whole scene. And I knew if I went up through the chain of command, somebody, the dean of letters and sciences or chancellor or somebody, oh, we can't have that. But they escorted these guys, parked at the office of the campus police and escorted them to my room. And they were all dressed, armed to the hilt with everything, into the room. But there it was, and I have copies of that on the Daily Bruin. Really fun stuff. And then the kids, they didn't think they were going to start firing, you know, so all came, and they started shooting it out up there, you know, and smoke and everything. And anyway, it was just really fun stuff. Yeah.
What an experience.
It's fun.
Wish I'd had one of those classes.
Well, you've got to have fun.
Yeah.
You learn better when it's fun.
Absolutely. Andy?
Thank you so much. The next question is in regards to what the mountain men ate. What was their process for preserving meat? I imagine the buffalo, like jerky making process takes a long time. Buffalo, meat goes bad, and it takes them a while to get from the plains to the
Well, it didn't go bad that fast. Remember the temperatures. You could hang meat outside. Remember, you're up there in Montana, Wyoming, Idaho. You could hang meat outside, and evidently the temperatures much of the year were just right for aging the meat and tenderizing the meat. So they'd hang meat outside. But yeah, they would dry meat, they would salt it. There was also, they could preserve it. They'd pack meat in oil, fish oil, different ways. But normally they made jerky. They'd salt it and dry the meat. And then sometimes, like in pemmican, they would add some berries to it and other things for flavor. But yes, we think today as things going bad, that was only in the summer months. The mountain men talked about there were 3 months in the beaver country: July, August, and winter. And we're all Southern California softies down here. But yes, the temperatures in that high country. Remember, they spent, the high plains are literally high. They're a mile high. Denver's on the high plains. Denver's the mile high city, okay? I've stood, and you've probably stood too, on the plaque they have. 5,280 feet, right, in Denver, the plaque, a mile high. Okay, that's on the plains. Then you go up in the mountains. So the mountain men, much of the time, they were 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet up in this country. And as I said, even when they were on the high plains, they were a mile high. So this is high dry. And meat doesn't spoil that fast in that country, especially during 5, 6, 7 months of the year when the temperatures are so low. So that wasn't the kind of problem we think of today. And when it was, yeah, they salted the meat, dried it.
Great, thank you so much. Forgot to turn on my mic. The final question of the night is if we want to learn any more about the mountain men or this sort of style of living, can you recommend some books or movies or documentaries or anything that we could learn more about this?
Well, there are several documentaries that I've been in several documentaries on the mountain men. There's some good stuff. There's a, you have to. Yeah, I mean, the problem with documentaries, for television, they have to be about 48 minutes, because hour long, and then they have ads, even on A&E, which then had a dedicated history channel, and the others. So it's difficult to get it on there, but you can look them up. One of the first documentaries I did was with the series The Real West, on the mountain men. And that series, Greystone Productions, on the mountain men, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good one. If you look up the Real West series, the host kind of introduced it was Kenny Rogers, and on the mountain men. That's pretty good. And there's other ones that I did you can find, and I'm pretty sure you could probably find them on YouTube, something like that. But 2 movies which really be good, because a little longer length, and they can do greater recreations. Across the Wide Missouri with Clark Gable, and The Mountain Men with Charlton Heston and Brian Keith. Both those, I recommend those highly. And then in books, I think a good introduction, because I would recommend all sorts of books. It would probably be too much detail and too specific, but a good one to introduce you to all this would be, again, Across the Wide Missouri. I mean, that's how the movie got its name, Bernard DeVoto, just like it sounds, DeVoto, D-E-V-E-V-O-T-O. DeVoto, Bernard DeVoto, Across the Wide Missouri, is a good introduction to all this. Good. And then there's a lot of specific books on the different mountain men. There's a great one, but it may be a bit dense to start out with, but it's a great, by Dale Morgan. Jedediah Smith and the Opening of the West is a great one. There's a great one on Tom Fitzpatrick by Leroy Haffen, H-A-F-E-N, Leroy Haffen, Broken Hand. The life of, I think the subtitle is The Life of Thomas Fitzpatrick or something, Broken Hand. Because he broke his hand taking a horse. He was chased by several dozen Blackfeet, and he went off a 40-foot bluff with his horse, rifle, everything, 40 feet down into the Yellowstone River. And it was either that or have 3 dozen Blackfeet strip you of your flesh and dismember you. And in the fall, his rifle accidentally discharged and sent a round through his wrist and his hand. He managed to get across the river and disappear in some woods, although pursued for 2 or 3 days by the Blackfeet. But he eluded them and went on to still, he had been already a veteran mountain man, but that's why he's known as Broken Hand, because he had a slightly disfigured hand. So it's a great book on Tom Fitzpatrick. There's good ones on Jim Bridger. It's a good one on Kit Carson. There's many, but start with, I think, a good general overview Across the Wide Missouri.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Ken, that's it from the chat. Once again, thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope you join us again here at the World Famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles.
Okay. So, Roger, one more thing. You wrote a book. Would you like to give that a plug?
Yeah, well, my principal book, I'm a co-author of other books too, but one that is I think, a fairly good read for the general public about violence in the Old West, and this specifically in 2 mining camps of the Old West. It's focuses on Bodie and Aurora. And people know about Bodie today because about 5% of it still exists.
Yes.
People think a lot's there, but 95% is not. But it's still neat that we have what is there of Bodie. It's a state park today. Well, I looked at Bodie and Aurora. Aurora was first. In the early 1860s, it boomed. Bodie boomed in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And what I wanted to determine was how much violence there really was in the Old West, and what was the nature of that violence. And like you said earlier, was it wildly exaggerated and this happened or that happened? And I thought the mining camps was the place to look. First of all, not much had been done on the violence in the mining camps, whereas a lot had been done on the cattle towns of Kansas. And what I knew by that point of reading and researching of the mining camps in the West, there were gunfights aplenty. And the saloons of the mining camps is where people should have been looking for all the years, instead of these cattle towns and the cowboys. No. The mining camps was where it was at. And there's a big reason for that. The mines had a lot of conflicting claims. And because of that, they hired guns to intimidate the other mining companies. And so you had the real professionals in the mining camps. But you also had Ken and Raj out there too, that we got drunk in the saloons. And there's this whole code of honor in the Old West. The code that I'll die before I'll run. And your honor was everything to you. And again, this is one of these ironies. They were out there to strike it rich. But material things didn't mean anything to them at that moment when somebody challenged them. Everything was their honor and their courage. And so they fought. And often this meant death, you know. But just as often, because it was not well lit in the saloon, these saloons were crowded. Unlike movies they make, no, these things were packed. And they were all male, by the way. Women were in dance halls. Prostitutes were in brothels or someplace. They didn't have these saloon girls that we think of today. No. It was an all, like the Adventurers Club. It was fraternal. It was an all-male preserve. And these men would get jostled and fire, and so very often they'd have shootouts, people were wounded, and they wouldn't prove fatal unless later infections set in. Sometimes, though, they were deadly. So you had regular shootouts, and you had, but here's the difference. They were between willing combatants and citizens who didn't want to get involved in that, didn't want to spend the wee hours of the morning in a saloon, didn't want to challenge somebody, didn't want to drink, didn't want to fight. The regular citizenry didn't experience a kind of crime that we experience in American towns today. The crime for those people was more like a little isolated town in Idaho or Utah today. They just didn't experience crime. Now for young, reckless, courageous males in the saloon, yes. But for the general citizenry, no. They were generally very peaceful in that sense. You know, women were not raped. I mean, women were treated with the utmost respect. If you so much as use profanity in front of respectable women, you know, not prostitutes in a brothel or someplace, but or in an opium den, they existed. You know, little Chinatowns existed. But in front of respectable women, you were fined and jailed. I mean, can you imagine that? In America today, think about that, using profanity in front. And women again and again said, oh, I never felt safer than I did with the boys, you know, the frontiersmen, prospectors of these towns in America of that era in the West. Think about that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I focus on this, and this is what I came up with. I didn't know I was going to find this, but this is what I found, and I compared it statistically too. Much of that's in an appendix, and I do things, but at the end of chapters, I compare some things about assault and robbery and homicide and such. I compare it with American towns today, American towns in that era, and everything. And so I found it was the average citizen found peaceful existence in the West. Unless you were a young guy looking for trouble, then you'd find it.
Yeah, it was there if you wanted
You'd
it.
find it and fight. But nobody's greatly upset about that because we had chosen to fight. Mm-hmm. And if it was a generally fair fight, nobody took advantage under certain circumstances, then they'd have some kind of hearing in justice court and it'd be dropped. Mm-hmm. Now, if somebody took some kind of advantage and ran up behind somebody, shot him in the back of the head in some circumstance like that, it would go up and
That's
be
different.
it would
It's not a matter of honor at that point.
it would go up and be tried. Be tried. Anyway, this is more than you want to know for the.
Well, I do want to know the name of the book.
I can't even think of it now. You guys have to look it up. Now, I don't want to promote
All right.
my book. If somebody's interested, you can find that on Amazon under my name or something. If you're interested, but yeah, I came here for the Adventurers Club. This is something that since I was a little kid, I've heard tales of the Adventurers Club and all the things the members have done. I mean, that's back in the early 1950s. I heard about this, and to be here with all of you and in the club itself, and to see everything that's here, this is just a privilege, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
Well, we're so pleased to have had you here and appreciate you taking the time and coming to see us and talk to us. So,
Gunfighters, highwaymen, and vigilantes.
there you go.
Fine, I'm this anyway.
Thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. We're looking forward to opening the club again soon. So hopefully in about a month or so, we'll be more active than we were. And until then, we'll continue having these programs, and we'll continue having these programs after that. So continue tuning in, subscribe to the channel. Have a great evening. Come back next week.